listening to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network, the nonprofit organization that strives to address the staggering disparity in resource availability for individuals suffering from mental health disorders, processing disorders, addictions, trauma healing, and sexual identity challenges. Together, we strive to end the stigma associated with these challenges so that true healing can begin. Welcome back to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network. I am your host, Ange, and I am grateful for your support of our mission and welcome you to join us in building a world where individuals with mental health challenges receive comprehensive and effective treatment without worrying about financial burdens to themselves or their families or the stigma often associated with it. Today, we are honored to have Maddie share her story of overcoming sexual trauma and learning to thrive. Maddie is completely badass, and I cannot wait for everyone to hear her story of resilience. Since this podcast deals with mental health challenges, many episodes may contain triggering topics. This episode specifically mentions sexual trauma, suicidal ideations, self-harm, addiction, and other similar topics. If you feel triggered, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and/or, if in the United States, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which is a national network of local crisis centers that provide free and confidential emotional support to people in suicidal crisis or emotional distress, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Asking for help is not a sign of weakness. In fact, after I published episode 1, which featured my story, I went and hung out with a friend to listen to it in a safe and supportive environment. If these topics are sensitive to you, I encourage you to do the same. So, what are we waiting for? Fill up your coffee and let's get started. Welcome, listeners. I am very excited to welcome you to episode number 9. I have Maddie here with me today, and she and I were just chatting before we started record. She's the first individual for this podcast that I've interviewed that I actually do not know her story at all. So listeners, you and I are hearing this at the exact same time together, and I'm really excited. So Maddie, I'm going to pause and let you introduce yourself. Please share, if you feel comfortable, as much about your name, your pronouns, whatever you would like to share, and then tell us why you're passionate about being here today.
So my name's Maddie, and when Ange reached out and asked me to be on this podcast, it was a huge honor. As I was kind of thinking about, why am I passionate about this? A couple things came to my head. One being mental health and trauma aren't talked about enough. And it is so important to talk about it because so many people feel alone. And when in reality, there's so many different ways that you can connect with people. The other reason being it's important to bring awareness to the mental health care system and the judicial system and how that kind of plays into trauma and treatment and the different resources that were provided and the challenges that were faced. And then last being, I want to advocate for change in the way mental health and trauma is treated and supported and valued in society. And I really feel like this podcast does all of those things.
I just got chill bumps. I'm so excited. This is awesome. And so I think everyone has their coffee ready to go. Why don't you kick off and begin wherever in your story you would like to start? Go for it.
I'm going to give just a little bit of backstory on my upbringing, because that has a lot to do with and ties into a lot with my story. I was raised in a very Christian household. My parents were an amazing example of marriage. My parents really genuinely taught me morals and values. And so that had a lot to do with my upbringing. So as a kid, on paper, I was the perfect kid. I didn't drink, I didn't party, I was a virgin and had a really strong belief system. And I wanted to save that for when I was married. Like I volunteered at church, I played soccer. I knew from day one out the gate that I wanted to be a teacher. And so that's kind of the perception that I had going into my sexual trauma. Long story short, at 19, from 15 to 19, I was being groomed by my dad's boss, who eventually became an extremely close family friend, was around during holidays, birthdays, cookouts, the whole nine. And when I was 19, that was the first time that I was drugged and raped by him at his home. And I was so naive. It took me like 2.5 years after the fact to truly be able to identify that that's what happened to me. And so my sexual abuse went on for about 6 months. And I was finally able to be strong enough to say, I'm done. Like, this is not okay. For about 3.5 years after that, I hid it from my family to protect my family because there were threats made by him towards my family. So for 3.5 years, I was pretending what happened to me never happened. I was still engaging in family cookouts and dinners and holidays with my perpetrator present and having to pretend like everything was okay. Looking back, I wouldn't have changed what I did as far as protecting my family. But with that being said, because of that, my statute of limitations ran out. And I had no proof. And so throughout that, the fact that I'll never get justice for that, and he is out walking the streets, living his everyday life, made me really angry for a very long time. And I allowed that to control my life. In a nutshell, that is the base of my trauma. The aftermath of that, what that looked like was I was self-medicating. I found my worth and my value in sex because that was taken away from me. And so that's the value that I saw myself worth for. I was numbing with alcohol. I was engaging in cutting. And that was something that I had never engaged in up until that point. I isolated. My suicidal ideations were pretty bad. And I was angry. And, it really made me question my faith and God. Like, on paper, I did everything that I'm supposed to do. I lived my life the way that I was supposed to live. So why did you let this happen to me? And it's taken me a long time to be able to identify just my faith and where my trauma connects. But it's been a journey. It's been something that I've had to really work on. I was in and out of treatment. I was teaching. I'm an elementary school teacher. I was teaching, but was dissociating. And I was standing in front of these class of kids, 7 and 8-year-old kids. And looking back, I can't remember a single thing that I taught them. And so I was trying so hard to find my worth and my value in anything. Eventually that became teaching. But because of where I was at with my mental health, I wasn't able to do my job and do it well. When I wasn't able to do that, then I was stuck with where's my value now? And so ultimately, at the end of the school year, 2 years ago, I made the decision to go from therapy once a week to admitting myself into a residential facility in Florida called The Refuge. It was the scariest thing I've ever done in my entire life, and I wouldn't change it for the world. It was It was like this safety bubble of people that you could learn from and ask questions, and there was no shame built around it. And there was no judgment because everyone knew that the questions that you were asking were coming from a genuine place instead of judgment. And to be in an environment like that was so incredibly healing for me. And I learned so much. I got out of treatment 2 Decembers ago for the last time, and my insurance dropped me after 18 days. Before that, I was in 3 other facilities leading up to that. I had a really bad medication side effect that landed me in the ER twice within 12 hours in Florida. I live in Pennsylvania. And so my ER experience was so traumatic on top of that, because when hospitals see that you're coming from a facility, you have all of those stigmas thrown on top of that. And so it was awful. And then the next facility I went to, I had gotten so sick that within 4 hours of being there, I had a pseudo seizure and I was discharged within 24 hours as a medical liability until I could get cleared by a neurologist. So I came home, went to a neurologist, got scans. Because I had that episode, I lost my license for 6 months. I had just gotten back into a facility. I'd been there for 18 days. Like, I was finally getting healthy and making progress. And insurance said, you know what? You've been in and out of treatment so much. You've been in here for 18 days. Since you do not have an active plan for suicide, we no longer feel like you need this level of care. As you talked about in a few other episodes, I mean, that can happen within hours. And then it's a scramble to find aftercare and find a way either to those aftercare facilities or home. And so when I got home, I was so defeated. I was at the lowest that I had ever been. And to this day, it is a miracle that I'm still alive. There was a lot of really amazing people that crossed paths with me at the right time and the right place. So as I was working through that, the big question is, when did it switch? When did the switch go off? As far as, I'm a victim, I am so low that I can barely fight for myself. And I was meeting with my mentor the one day, and she looked at me and she's like, Maddie, you're not going to like this question. But she's like, do you think that you are stuck in the role of victim mentality? And I looked at her and I was like, you're right. Don't like that question. But I just sat with it for a few seconds. And she looked at me and she's like, what happened to you is not your fault. And it's your responsibility to heal from it. And she looked at me and she goes, the ball's in your court. It is up to you to fight for yourself. She's like, no one else can do it for you. When we talked about it, I'm like, yeah, I'm in the part of my recovery where I'm stuck. I'm stuck in the victim mentality, and I'm stuck in, well, this is just who I am because of what someone else did to me. And that was the switch for me. I remember laying on her living room floor, just bawling, because I knew that that was the moment where either I moved forward or I refused. And it is so much easier. It feels safer to stay stuck because it's predictable. You know the outcome. Versus it is so scary to go on the other side of that, the other side of healing, because you have no idea what that looks like. It's not predictable. It's foreign land. And so that was a switch for me. To this day, that was the most pivotal moment in my recovery so far. And I also knew that the lifestyle that I was living at the time was going to kill me if I didn't change it. Flashing forward to where I am today, right? So healing's not linear. And so I'm continuing therapy. I'm continuing working with my mentors. And the biggest thing right now in my healing journey that I'm learning is, or I should say, relearning how to love myself again, because I lost that. I lost who I was because I was so wrapped up in my identity being what happened to me that I forgot who I was. The biggest thing that I'm learning right now is, in order to relearn how to fall back in love with myself, I have to learn how to love every single part of me, even the ones that kept me safe, that I no longer need to keep me safe. It's really easy to get wrapped up in just the negative spiral of who you've been told you were for so long, and then you've adapted that into who you think you are, and it's all a false narrative. That's where I'm at right now. It has been the biggest blessing. I teach in inner city Harrisburg in Pennsylvania. It has been, I've asked myself and I've asked God, how are you going to turn something so painful and so horrible into something good? And I asked it for 8.5 years, every day, going to work every day. That's it. Because of everything that I learned in treatment and everything that I've learned while being on my healing journey, I get to teach my kids who have experienced unimaginable traumas. With my kids, I teach second grade, so 7 and 8-year-olds. I have the honor and the privilege to teach them about their bodies and why they're reacting to certain things the way that they are in kid-friendly language, and showing them different ways to find healthy coping mechanisms to help regulate their bodies. So this has been the hardest journey of my entire life, but it just continues to show up in my life of, I wouldn't be able to teach these kids the way that I am and reach them the way that they am if I didn't experience what I experienced. It's so important to have a voice, because if you don't use it, then you don't get to bless other people around you who are struggling, who don't have a voice. So that is my journey in a nutshell.
Well, you are amazing, and your story is amazing. And I can relate on so many different areas. I was abused by my mother from the day I was born. But then when I was 7, I was abused for 6 years. And all of my first sexual experiences were with a family member for the first. And so I also was tied into, I wasn't worthy unless that was the only way. And I was really good in school and really successful in these other areas. But I learned a lot of behaviors and coping mechanisms in a very similar way. My eating disorder came as a consequence of abuse from my mom. She would feed my brothers and make me watch. And so I learned, if I'm not hungry, she's not hurting me. Or in the sex component of it, if, I can manage this, then that individual is not hurting me. Therefore, other people are not hurting me. Yeah. A lot of the things you mentioned, cutting, I think there's so much in a stigma, and so much of society doesn't understand self-harm. And they immediately think anyone who has self-harm and cutting is immediately trying to complete suicide, they're two very different things. I mean, I struggled with self-harm. I struggled with self-harm when I was in residential treatment many times, because the other coping mechanisms that had worked for me in the past were no longer available. So I had to come up with something else, and I did. And that numbing of the pain and numbing of the trauma, and mine was very tied to nightmares from my kidnapping. Yeah. And so that felt like, this is a fix. This is a Band-Aid. This is duct tape. Duct tape is way more successful than what any of those addictions are, quite frankly, because duct tape actually works. And those other things, they don't work. And so I love you sharing that. Episode 6, we talked with the host of the Sex Addicts Recovery podcast. And one of the things that he and I talked about was how many individuals with sex addictions in a variety of ways deal with this. They started with childhood trauma, and that so many of those individuals, their whole identity and self-worth was tied to that sexual trauma that they had that then played out later in life. And I think that, in many different areas of struggling, whatever that toolbox is that we were given at that stage in our life, if it appeared to us as if it worked, it seemed like it was a good toolbox to work.
Yeah.
And oh my gosh, the statute of limitations. I'm not sure that I've shared this yet on the podcast, but when I escaped from my kidnapping, when I first went to the police station, the lady that checked me in, the officer, was so mean to me. She was convinced that this was something with an ex-boyfriend and I was a disgruntled ex-girlfriend. I was literally bawling, crying, saying to her, "You were so mean to me." I was grateful that I had a friend who was a police officer who I then left the police station. I called him. He connected me with the head of the special victims unit, who was so compassionate, and it was a very different journey. But that trauma in the legal system was just mind-boggling. And I think that a lot of individuals don't understand the hamper that has. And people say, "Oh, you should have said someone, you should have done da da da." But living in that world, there are no shoulda, coulda, woulda. You're just trying to survive.
No. And for me, it took me so long to actually be able to understand what happened to me. The way that I was manipulated to understand it was I was having an affair and I was an equal in that quote unquote relationship. So it took me almost 2.5 years to be able to realize that that was not an affair. I did not have equal part in that. And it wasn't a relationship. I had never really been in a serious relationship leading up to that. So then my perception of a relationship became so skewed. And one of the things that my would say to me is, "No one can love you the way that I do." And I've heard it in so many stories. And it's something that took me a really long time to be able to truly, genuinely believe with my head and my heart and my soul that that is not true.
Or that perhaps maybe he was right, because you don't want anyone to love you the way that he, quote unquote, loved you. That's exactly
also true. Also true. Yeah.
Yeah, that is the mind blowing, just the messages that are sent and the repeated component of it. I had a question I was going to ask, and then I just lost my train of thought, which is so much fun when that happens. So I think, Maddie, as you're looking at in your situation and in the treatment centers and the tools that you did gain, can you maybe share a couple of the successes that you had in your various treatment centers? Like, what did you add to your toolbox? What did you find that you learned from those experiences that have allowed you to progress on this healing journey? I want to ask that question. The thing that I was going to say that I forgot was I wanted to relate to your challenge with your relationship with God and with your church. I also grew up in the church. And when I was kidnapped and I was held hostage those 5 days, oh my gosh, I prayed to God to release me the whole time. And so it's taken me several years after that to kind of come to the same place that you are, that there is self-will in this scenario.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. One thing that I've really had to look at is the difference between God's will, man's will, and free will. And when you really pull that apart and you look at it, it really, for me, helped me see that God didn't do this to me, or it was someone's free will that did that to me. And it really allowed me to take away the blame that I had and the anger that I had put towards God. And it's still a work in progress, don't get me wrong, but yeah.
When I think that can tie to anything, I mean, we have listeners from all over. And so some, their higher power or their other component in it may have a similar thing. So for example, as a parent, if your child has been abused, you may spend years, decades blaming yourself for something that you had zero control over. And it's really trying to, I know for me, piece together, okay, I am willing to take responsibility for the actions that I took, that I made the decision to take. And I should take that responsibility. However, I am not taking the responsibility of this individual who knew better. I'm not taking the responsibility of this. And therefore, by also saying I'm not taking the responsibility for somebody else and their actions, I also need to take a step back and say, am I blaming someone or something, or am I passing blame on an area that's not helpful, that is also not appropriate? I think all areas of the spectrum can really, we should own what we can own, let go of what we can let go, and move forward when we can.
Mm-hmm.
So what other tools do you have? So one of them, it was identifying that, like, what was will? How do I move past that? Are there some tools that you, Maddie, use maybe in your daily practice? Because recovery is not linear. It is ongoing and continuing growth. What are some of your tools that you use right now that you perhaps maybe learned in some form of treatment that's been beneficial?
So one thing that's been really therapeutic for me is writing. At the refuge, as you know, they would give writing assignments. And writing's always been my way to process and my way to communicate, because I can control it and I can edit it and rework it until I know for a fact that when it is read, that it will be read exactly the way that I intend it to be read. And so at the refuge, the assignments were so therapeutic because I was able to come from so many different angles and so many different perspectives. So, and that's something that I continue to do. Something will hit me throughout the day and I'll jot it down. And then when I get my brain starts going, and once my brain starts going, I'll stop everything that I'm doing and I'll just write. So that's super therapeutic for me. Breathing. So many people were like, Maddie, yoga. And I'm like, hold up. I played soccer my entire life. I have been a contact athlete, and the thought of doing yoga, I was like, absolutely not a chance going to happen. I'm like, give me a ball and someone to hit, and we're golden. We're good. That was also became part of my identity, which was a whole nother aspect of relearning who I was outside of all of these different roles that I was playing in my own life. And I tried it, and it has been incredible. Now, don't get me wrong, I am no yoga pro expert, but even just stretching. The one night I was watching TV and I just started stretching because I had read about how trauma is stored in your body, especially sexual trauma. And so I was stretching and just was really intentional with my thoughts and my breathing. I broke out in tears, bawled uncontrollably. And I'm like, what is happening? What is wrong? And when I had called my mentor the next day, she's like, Maddie, you've done the research. She's like, I'm not quite sure why this is surprising to you. She's like,
He's like, you're a smart girl. You know what this is.
She's like, so what have we learned from this? And I'm like, that it is actually a thing, that it is so incredibly therapeutic. And ever since then, if I have random downtime, I'll just like start stretching, like swimming. Like the other day, I was swimming in my parents' pool and I just like stopped for a moment and like really focused on like, how does the water feel against my skin? Just, yeah. And my biggest thing is slowing down and taking in all of like the beauty and the blessings around us. So like that's been really helpful too. And I'm not a very structured 5 things you can see for and I mean, some of those tools work for people and I've seen it work. I'm more of a just pause and what do I notice? And I actually did that last night, just like, because I was, work's been stressful. I'm already starting to get the like first day of school nightmare dreams. And yeah, just realizing that that's a tool that I'm strengthening more and more without really even being aware of it. So that's been super helpful. Another thing is just like talking about my experiences to like other people. I feel like people don't really realize the value of sharing your story. And when I say share your story, I also want to emphasize like in a safe space with safe people, because I used to be an oversharer. I used to be two different narratives. One being, I'm going to throw all of my baggage, all of my stuff on the table so that if you run, then I don't have to be invested in a relationship that will fall apart because of my baggage. The other angle being, I want loved and valued, and I want you to know all of this stuff so that you can understand me and so that I don't seem broken or like that I have all of these problems. Like, I need you to know why. I need to explain myself to you. Through my healing journey, I'm slowly starting to be like, my trauma is not who I am, nor do I need to explain anything to anyone about my recovery, about my healing, about my trauma, unless I deem it safe and I deem it necessary. It's another thing that I've learned in the recovery process. One of the biggest things for me is just helping people, whether that's my 7 or 8-year-olds or people that I've crossed paths with in treatment. I still stay connected with a lot of people that I've met, and just finding the opportunities to share my story and seeing the light bulb go off in someone's brain as I'm explaining something that I've experienced or that I've learned is the most amazing experience, just to watch it click, because it takes me back to the moment that someone was vulnerable with me and shared their story with me and their understanding and knowledge of mental health and trauma. And the moment it clicked for me, being able to pay it forward is probably one of the most therapeutic things that are in my toolbox that help me.
I love that. Absolutely. So I'm thinking of a couple of things, especially when I love that you are blessed with amazing parents who loved you and taught you that value of yourself and taught you all of those core values. And then I also think, being a mom, and I really hope I've taught those things to my daughter, I wonder, what advice would you give to parents who may at some point hear a story like this from their son or daughter because it happens to individuals, all genders. What advice would you give to those parents on how they can be the most supportive of their child as they're going through this journey?
My parents are just amazing people. From stories that I've heard, not everyone has that reaction to this is what happened to me. The first thing out of my parents' mouths were, I believe you. As a parent, or I should say, observing my parents, being able to look at your child and say, I believe you, is the best thing that my parents could have said. By saying that you believe that person, it takes a lot from the parent perspective, because you're flooded with all of these emotions and instantly you start blaming yourself. The fact that my parents' first instinct was, I believe you, I didn't have to explain anything. I didn't have to defend myself. And so first and foremost, just sometimes the simplest thought is the answer. Like, I believe you, not tell me everything that happened, not like questioning it, turning into an intervention. When someone, or I should say, when I sat down and shared what happened to me with my loved ones, the last thing that I wanted to hear was 1,000 questions and just having to explain and go into details of things that were so far off of my brain, that the fact that I could just look at my parents and say one simple sentence, yes, that happened to me. The fact that they looked at me without any regard for their initial parental shame, blame, guilt, my parents were able to just pause and love me right where I was at. I guess one of my biggest advice would be, you don't need to say 1,000 things. You don't need to try and fix. Don't try and fix it. It is not your responsibility to fix it. We just want loved. We want loved right where we're at, in the mess, in the midst of just darkness and fear and anger and guilt and shame. We just want loved and heard. I think the other piece to it is, and this might be a little abrasive, but it's not about you. It's not. Like, it is your responsibility to navigate your own feelings and your own emotions. It's not my job to do that for you. It's hard not to take things personally, and it's hard to be really intentional about the lens that you're coming from, the angles that you're coming from. It's a hard truth, but it's not about you. That's been something that I've had to be really intentional about explaining to my parents, because the first instinct that so many parents have is jump in and fix. And if you're not receiving my help or my mode of fixing things, then you hate me. You don't love me. Like, you're pushing me away and all I want to do is help you. The more that you push someone who is in recovery for anything, trauma, substance, sexual abuse, we just need loved and we don't need pushed, because healing's not linear and it is certainly not on any sort of time frame. And that was one of the most frustrating things for me. And I know that for a lot of loved ones, that's frustrating too, because from that perspective, you're like, but she was doing so well, and now she's back to isolating, or now she's back to drinking. Just do what you can to make yourself better for your loved one.
Wow, I love that. That is so powerful.
When you're healing, boundaries are so crucial. So crucial. When you're healing, you need those boundaries to be respected without having to explain why you need those boundaries, if that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of a couple of things. What would you say to the mental health industry or to the insurance industry? Because one thing is, a listener, if you've not been in this world and you don't understand the challenge, you may hear the message, well, insurance paid for this person to go to here and this person to go to here. And so why should insurance continue to pay for, whereas no one would ever say that if you went to the doctor because you had a broken leg, and then you went to a doctor because then you had an ulcer in your stomach, and then you went to the doctor because you had cancer and you were dying of cancer, your insurance should still cover those until you are healed and healthy.
Yep.
But if you're on the outside, you may look and say, well, I'm listening to this story and Maddie is badass, which you are badass. Thanks. And it doesn't seem like insurance could have helped anyways. So maybe there's not a problem. Maybe the problem isn't that the Mental Health Institute, and I'm clearly playing devil's advocate because I've heard people say these things and it's just like, oh my gosh, you're so wrong. And, from my experience, I had that kidnapping and it manifested in me in debilitating nightmares to drinking. So I started my journey at a rehab center at Blue Ridge Mountain Recovery Center. And the episode following this is going to talk with someone who I worked with at that treatment center, and they were amazing to start my journey in healing, right? And so I was there, and at that point I couldn't drink, so I decided I wasn't going to eat and I was going to do self-harm. So then I made my way down to the refuge and the what I call eating disorder camp. Yep. And guess what? Those healings did not stop my debilitating nightmares. And so it wasn't, my part of the story where insurance dropped me was my psychiatrist said, okay, I need you to go into a residential treatment place because I had not slept in 6 months. I mean, and there's a reason sleep deprivation is used in war as torture in war. And so I just couldn't even live a life. I mean, I could not sleep. Like, no one deserves to every night basically be kidnapped and have those things happen every night. So I went into a treatment center, and then on day 10, my insurance and the doctors there were like, she's very suicidal. She's self-harm. She's still not sleeping. And we can't figure out what medication to help her finally sleep. And my insurance was like, okay, no, send her home. And unfortunately, I ended up being somewhat blessed in that the treatment center actually scholarshiped me for a period of time and ate some of that cost, because they were like, we cannot in good conscience send this individual home. And here was a victim the entire time. And insurance was just like, nope. Because now if I was there multiple times for alcohol or drugs, it goes to a different area. And so it is if the mental health industry has figured out, well, it's fine, we'll continue to pay for these treatments. But if your trauma and your coping mechanisms fall into a different category, such as self-harm, then you need to be on a 5150 or, a psych ward where you were treated horribly. Or if it is with the nightmares, for example, like, no, you can have this short period of time, but then we're sending home, which would never happen if you had cancer and went in. They wouldn't say, oh, you've been here 10 days, so just go ahead and go home. That wouldn't happen. So what would you say on your end to, one, have people understand that it has nothing to do with those number of times you needed to receive healthcare to be healthy, to recover from what you needed? So what would you say to those individuals? And then what would you say to the insurance or even the treatment facilities about how they should view someone coming in with the plethora of challenges that you had as a consequence of this?
I think that it is so important to highlight how much courage and strength it takes to ask for help. For me to get to the place where I was willing to ask and accept help was one of the bravest, courageous things that I have ever done. When the mental health care system is seen as less than, the message that it's sending to people who are survivors of trauma or struggling with mental health, that it doesn't matter if you had a broken leg or if you had cancer. That's a totally different ballgame, because they can visibly see it with their eyes. Mental health comes in so many different forms. it's sad to me that some people have this like stigma that in order for you to be bad enough to need help, you need to have a full-blown meltdown, can't breathe, can't function. It breaks my heart. Mental health is behind everything. It's connected to your physical health. If mental health care was taken more seriously, it would take away the stigma of the shame behind it, number one. Number two, it would create a culture and a community that talking about it is okay and seeking help is brave versus good luck. Like mental health is literally connected to your physical health. So if you take care of the mental health part, as a healthcare provider, you're going to minimize the amount of illnesses that are connected with mental health. So as a healthcare provider, I wish that they were able to see the connection between the two, because as far as financials from an insurance company, they're so concerned about, well, it's multiple thousands of dollars a day to keep this person in a facility that is going to help them. And they're willing to drop that when in the long term, it's going to come back tenfold. I just wish that people were willing to choose not to be ignorant, and not ignorant in like the connotation that sometimes it carries because of how people use that word. I mean, choosing to be naive is your choice. Choosing to be uneducated is your choice. I'm responsible for me. You're responsible for you. Educate yourself on topics and things before you decide your own opinion about it and passing your own judgment. And a lot of times it comes from their own insecurities. It's just like a domino effect. And I know for me, once I educated myself about trauma and about mental health and about substance, it allowed me to genuinely see the foundational piece of what mental health is. And I wish people educated themselves more before they started throwing their own opinions on top of it.
One of the key goals of this podcast is to provide the voices of individuals from all different areas of mental health, not just one segment, but across the board. So I feel very blessed to get to meet someone like you and hear your story and your words of wisdom, because I'm absolutely going to use those words of wisdom when I talk to somebody else and think about how to just be there for them and not try and fix them, but say, you deserve to have a voice, because everyone deserves to have a voice. And I also believe that when you look at treatment centers, and if I were going to talk to a treatment center, and in fact, the episode after this, I did talk to a treatment center. I've already done that recording. It's a great recording. Everyone should listen to it because Joshua is amazing. If more and more treatment centers also expanded their education into different types of recovery models, different things. You mentioned yoga, breath work. I'm a big fan of box breathing. That makes a big difference to me. The somatic treatment. So when you talked about swimming and feeling that on your body, one of the exercises I do is when I'm laying in bed, because I have so much trauma there, I'll feel like the sheets, like really soft sheets on my skin. And I'll like, this feels really good and soft and warm and cozy now, when and in the past, right, it didn't. And so somatic therapy, things like EMDR that we talked about on episode number 8, the one right before this, we talked a little bit about EMDR.
EMDR is amazing.
Yeah. So EMDR, what it can do. I'm a big fan of other podcasts. So I have never met Andrew Huberman. He has the Huberman Lab podcast. It's amazing. And he does a lot. He's done a lot of interviews with like Anna Lemke at Stanford that talks about addiction and talks about the dopamine pathway. So when we think about self-harm and sex addiction and those things, they exhibit this dopamine that's a fix. Well, if more and more treatment centers instead saw someone as, okay, they are behaving in this behavior, what are some other treatment modalities should we use? Is it EMDR? Is it the somatic therapy? Is it doing more mindfulness things? Like, let's try a broad range of things, because what works for one individual is not going to work for another. But if you can figure out exactly what it is will allow that person to heal, I think just even listening to you and the impact you're having, you're worth it. Like, that person is worth it. And if you're in the industry and you're building this treatment center or you're working in this treatment center, if you think those people surrounding you that are patients or clients there are not worth it, then you should go get another job. That would be the equivalent of saying, I'm a teacher, but I don't think anyone deserves to learn. You know, I would say that. But it happens in treatment centers all the time. So I would encourage that for education and family members to educate and say exactly to your loved one, how can I be here for you? You tell me what you need and some of those things. So I want to finish up our episode with, I hope you brought some of your favorite motivational quotes.
Of course.
You're awesome. So you want to share some motivational quotes?
I have a couple, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I am a big Brené Brown fan. Her books are incredible. I listen to her on some podcasts or some different recordings that she's done. It kind of goes along with, why do I share my story? One of the quotes that she says is, one day you will tell your story of how you overcame what you went through, and it will be someone else's survival guide. The second that I read it, it hit my heart so hard, because it's true. Stories that people have told me about how they've overcome things have become my survival guide. And my hope is that by sharing my story, that it can add things to others' toolboxes and be a part of their survival guide. Here's another one. I actually read it the other day for the first time, and it hit really hard. It was just, I was in like a stuck mindset, and I read it, and it says, sometimes when you're in a dark place, you tend to think that you were buried, but what if you've been planted? Right now in like my healing journey, there's been so many times where I'm like, oh, but this didn't work out. And I wanted, for example, I'm 28 and I struggle with this is not where I wanted to be at 28. At 28, I wanted to have X, Y, and Z. I wanted a family. I wanted kids. And so looking at that quote, it reminds me that I've been planted. I haven't been buried. I've been planted. I think that is such an empowering thought to just sit on.
I love it. Well, I'm about to turn 48, which means that I'm old enough to be your mom. And also, I will share, I wish I was as strong and had the voice that you have when I was 28. And so you're amazing in that way. One of the things, and as I'm thinking about that, another podcast that I listened to, The Motivated Mind, he quotes a lot, don't compare your chapter 1 to somebody else's chapter 10. So I want to say to listeners, if you're listening to this and you're struggling, and maybe you have suicidal ideations, maybe you are stuck in addiction, maybe you're sitting in your car thinking, I want to go and tell the police or this family member that this happened to me. I want to do all these, and I can't do that. I can't be strong like what Maddie is. First off, I think Maddie just took it one step at a time, and she's at chapter 10 and you're at chapter 1, and you just have to take it one step at a time. Another quote that I've heard recently that I love is, and I tie it to myself, I've had so many hardships, and people say to me all the time, I could never survive what you've survived. there was this quote that said something like, you know what, if you've never lifted a 10-pound weight, you think you can never lift a 10-pound weight. But once you've been forced to lift that 10-pound weight, guess what? You can. And you can probably lift a 20-pound weight or a 30-pound weight. So you maybe think that you could never accomplish or never survive something, but you can, because you can be strong through that journey. So don't compare yourself to somebody else's stage of recovery. Your story is unique and your voice is unique. So thank you, Maddie, for sharing that. Do you have any final parting words that you want to leave us with today?
Just one more quote. I'm a quote person.
Me too.
And I saw this the other day. It hit me because I'm like, this in a nutshell is what healing is. And it says, healing can be so hard when your inner child wants love, your teenage self wants revenge, and your current self only wants peace. When I read that, and it kind of goes along with relearning how to love yourself and loving every single one of those parts and giving every single one of those parts equal amount of space. It inspired me because it allowed me to further remove another layer of shame and blame and guilt. I think it's important to be able to identify all three of those different parts because they all play a role.
So I want us to leave on that quote. So if you will do me a favor, will you read it one more time and then we'll end right after the end of it?
You got it. Healing can be so hard when your inner child wants love, your teenage self wants revenge, and your current self only wants peace.
Thank you.
You are very welcome. Thank you for having me. This has been such an honor and a blessing. So thank you very much for having me.
Listened to episode 9 featuring our guest Maddie, who shared her personal recovery story from sexual trauma. This episode mentioned sexual abuse, suicidal ideations, self-harm, and other mental health topics. If this episode was triggering to you, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and/or if in the U.S., dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. As a reminder, the experiences and advice expressed in this episode are the host and guest's own personal stories. Ran is passionate about opening the doors for all voices and experiences, not just those expressed in any particular podcast. If you would like to share your experiences or expertise, we encourage you to be a future guest by emailing us at podcast@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org or submit a blog post by emailing blog@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. In case you're wondering, every individual working with RAN does so on a 100% volunteer basis. All funds raised go to support the mission. So don't forget to love, not like, our podcast and subscribe. We have some amazing guests booked for future episodes. Trust me, you will not want to miss them. So subscribe today. We hope you will also connect with us at www.recoveryadvocatenetwork.org, where you can donate to the mission, read blog posts, and stay in the loop about upcoming events, including fundraising auctions. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Recovery Advocate Network and on Twitter at Ran to Wellness. If you wish to provide feedback, please feel free to leave comments on the episode or email us. Now, back to your coffee.